Okay, so here we're looking at Teleflex hydraulic steering cylinder, one of the SeaStar models, and we are diagnosing what appears to be seals failing and leaking out fluid and letting some slop get into the steering. So I have a pretty simple system of going over, just doing a quick diagnostic on these to figure out what's going on, and really it's not too complicated. So the first thing I do is just see how much play is in the motor, and here you can see, this is the way I'll do it for the camera. You can see there's a good bit of slop in there.
That's perfect.
And I use what I prefer to call the kick test, which is where I just kind of kick it back and forth a little bit like that. And you can see there's way too much movement in there. So we know we have either air in the system or some fluid has leaked out. The other thing I look at is I immediately look at the end cap seal, the end caps themselves, and see what they're looking like. And if I see where we have fluid coming through an end cap, and fluid buildup and dripping on the cylinder itself, then we know right off the rip we have a blown seal. And you can see over here on our port side of the cylinder that we have definite oil coming through the end of the cylinder itself. And if we put our hand down here down low, you can catch a little bit of it. And you can see we got a fair amount of steering fluid coming. Okay, now the next step we're going to take is to break the end caps loose on the cylinder. It's important to break those things loose before we do anything to destabilize the cylinder itself. It's in a good fixed position right here, and we can really put a little bit of torque on the cylinder itself to get those loose. Once we've taken the brackets and everything off, then the cylinder's kind of just wanting to move around with anything that touches it, and it's really difficult to get at the end caps at that point. So sometimes the end caps are a true nightmare to get off, and sometimes they're cooperative. We are going to adjust our spanner as needed and brace as well as we can and hope. And usually they don't fight too badly. There we go. That one's loose. So again, it's really important that we keep this thing well braced. We do not want the spanner popping loose and gouging the main rod here, because once that happens, we've got a very expensive problem on our hands. So again, we're just going to break it loose. So here I'm using a modified part of the Power Purge Junior that I use for bleeding these systems, and basically taking the return lines off, and what I do is put the return line into a jug and collect some of the fluid out of the cylinder so I can see what's coming out of there. And if I have really filthy, contaminated fluid, at that point I'm deciding whether or not to purge the entire system itself, or whether I can just basically bleed fluid into the cylinder and be done. There's quite a difference in cost there, so that's an important factor to consider. So we're just going to open these guys up enough to let some fluid out. Really doesn't take but about a half turn, but I usually go past that a little bit. Put our return line in here and see what comes out. Okay, at this point, we got a good sample of fluid out of the cylinder itself, and the fluid's probably mostly empty. Probably and mostly being key words. And what I'm looking at this point is just taking a look at what's in the hose. And what I like being able to see is, somewhat clear oil where I can see right through the hose. No debris and nothing that indicates, serious contamination. This stuff looks pretty good. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just do the reseal on the cylinder itself and bleed enough fluid through it so that I can fill this up, get all the air out of the entire system, and call it good. Okay, so here we are. At this point, we're going to go ahead and get the end caps unthreaded. As you can see, they're just coming apart pretty easily with our just using our hands. Probably a good bit of fluid left in there. No idea how much. Definitely some air. But just be prepared to see some fluid come out of here. That's why we have these oil absorbers down. They're pretty good at catching this stuff, but they're not foolproof. So definitely have plenty of them down. And we're gonna do the same thing on this side. All right, this one's ready for me to go ahead and pull the hardware. Now we're going to pull the nut and washer off of the support rod itself. Trying to be really careful of the motor, obviously. Being careful of the threaded rod there. This transom is a little bit tighter than a lot of them. A lot of the transoms these days have a little bit more room to work with. This one's quite confined. All right, feels like we got her. Yeah, it's loose. Okay, and now we are ready to get a puller on here. Okay, so here we've encountered the typical problem that I encounter on almost every one of these jobs on a steering cylinder that's been out there in the world for some length of time. We have a support bracket that is completely seized into place. You can see all the nuts and everything are off of here, and in a perfect world it would just slide right off. But this guy is locked on really nicely. So one of the things that really bothered me about doing this job over the years is this creates a big time waste trying to figure out a way to get this thing off, and the methods for getting this thing off are really just a lot less safe and exact than I would like them to be. It usually involves some form of air hammer or you know, a dead blow, you know, any of those things that basically you're just swinging a Stone Age tool at a really expensive piece of equipment. So what we have done is we've developed a puller for it, and what this does is basically just fits over the end of the support bracket here, and the main bolt has a cuff that pretty much locks it onto our support rod here. We get it in place and we can turn it and gently move this thing off, and in a perfect world not break anything. So right now, like I said, we are dealing with a rather confined transom, and I'm just threading this into place and trying to find the best fit for it. And in this case, we are tight for space, and what I'm going to do is put a cloth between my main bolt and our transom here in an effort to protect our customer's gel coat. And here we have a minimal amount of space for the puller itself to move backwards and get this bracket moving out of there. So I'm going to get a ratchet on it and start turning and see if we can break it loose. So I'm giving it a couple turns now. As you can see, it's slowly working its way loose. I'm just trying to be careful as much as possible of his actual transom, because as easily as this thing will break metal loose, it will certainly break gel coat loose a lot more easily. As you can see, we're just backing this thing off nice and slow. For me, this was a big deal. In the years that I worked in the dealership setting, this was the area where I would lose time on these jobs all day long, and obviously lose parts. And some of the shops you work in, you pay for what you break. And now we have this thing pretty well loose enough to come off by hand. Yeah, it's completely loose now. So, thread this guy off. And we're off. Okay. As you can see, there's all kinds of nice white crud built up in there. So as you can see here, steering rod is spinning as I try to back this nut off. So I'm going to use this other fancy tool that I've developed, which is a retired winch strap and a set of vice grips. And with any luck, there we go. All right, there we go. Quickly examine our rod, make sure the mechanic didn't damage it. As you can see, it's perfect. And we are ready to pull the steering rod out of the cylinder. Probably the messiest part of the process is trying not to get oil everywhere. There's always some left in there somewhere. Try not to run the threaded end of the steering rod against the walls of the cylinder itself.
Rolling.
All right. So what I'm doing now is inspecting the steering rod itself. Just making sure there's no severe pitting in the rod or anything that would indicate that, you know, premature failure of a new set of seals. And the rod looks pretty good. Severely pitted rods will rip up a new set of seals, causing premature failure of the expensive seal job you just did or paid to have done. And I like to avoid those conversations. So now, next thing I am just finishing wiping out the inside of the cylinder, making sure I have a nice perfect mirror finish in there again. Taking one last double check before I go back together with new seals. And yeah, it looks pretty darn flawless in there. No red flags. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull our bleed fittings loose and put new O-rings on here and verify that these guys are not clogged up with any sort of debris. That's an important step, and the rebuild kits that come with these that come with the seals themselves, you will get a new set of O-rings, and definitely change those out while you have this stuff all apart. Okay, so we have our bleed fitting with a new O-ring on it. I usually just put a little dab of fluid on there to make sure everything goes smoothly when I'm threading it back in. I do not like to see things pinch. The things I like to do is just make sure everything has good coat of grease on it and give it the best chance possible of staying in good working order for as long as possible. So just take our handy tube of Quicksilver 24C and just going to smear a little coat on there. As you can see, this support rod will not come all the way out without us pulling the motor off. We have a pretty confined cutout here in the transom. I would like to pull the whole assembly apart and, you know, just have a look in there and make sure, but this movement's really smooth. So I'm just greasing this thing up and putting it back in action. And we are going to try to prevent this thing from seizing up in the future, even though we know that that's impossible. So I'll put plenty of grease on the inside of our support bracket where it's going to be mounted on the support bar. But it really doesn't matter. If you give it enough time, the grease just helps it all stick together even more. So obviously a lot of this grease is coming right back off, but I just want to make sure that It will never be said that I didn't use enough grease. Okay. Go back with our washer. I'm just gonna thread this on a few turns now. So all we're doing now is putting the steering rod back through the cylinder and preparing to put a new set of seals on it. So when we're putting this thing back through, main thing we want to avoid doing is taking that nice set of threads and rubbing them down the inside of the cylinder. So as carefully as possible, just gonna thread it back through. Okay, we're gonna take our protective plastic fitting here. This comes with the reseal kit. Put it over the end of the rod there. And on she goes. At this point we can go ahead and thread that cap on. Make sure our bleed fittings are loose. This makes life a lot easier while we're adjusting all this stuff into place. At this point all we're doing is just threading everything back together. A little bit of grease over the end fittings here. Get the threads as well as we can. And then we're going to go ahead and, oh yeah, that's right, I already threaded the rod back through. Okay. Take just a drop or two of steering fluid and just make sure everything's got a little bit of fluid on it. Again, I'm just taking maximum care to avoid pinching any pieces of rubber or O-rings or anything like that. Thread this back on. A little bit more of our 2,4C. Now we're going to do the same thing with our steering rod. Okay, now the unit's back together, and I'm just going to tighten the end caps and bleed the unit. Need to get real crazy tightening the end caps on. I just want them threaded on all the way. And what I really don't want to do is scratch anything or damage anything. I just want to make sure it's threaded on nice and tight. Okay, that one's on.